The rain began just after dusk, a slow, deliberate tapping against the windows of the Faraday estate, as though the storm itself crept up the long gravel drive and decided to eavesdrop. The house stood alone on a hill, its narrow windows pale in the dimming light, its chimneys exhaling thin threads of smoke into the darkening sky. Inside, the silence was heavy, too heavy for a house once known for extravagant gatherings. Tonight, only one soul moved through its echoing corridors. Mrs. Eloise Faraday, the last surviving member of the once prominent Faraday family, had spent the evening in her private study, a locked room where she kept her most personal papers. She was found shortly after 9 o'clock, slumped over her writing desk, a half-finished letter beneath her trembling hand. The ink had pooled where the nib rested against the paper, as though she had been interrupted mid-thought. The doctor would later confirm that she was dead before she ever touched the floor. The door had been locked from the inside, no windows were open, no sign of forced entry, no weapon, no poison that could be immediately identified. The scene should have been simple, even peaceful, except for the single, impossible clue left behind. A small silver locket lay on the floor beside her chair, its chain broken, as if it had been ripped from someone's neck. Inside the locket was a black and white photograph of a young man no one recognized. The reverse bore a single inscription scratched in hurried strokes, "I never forgot." Inspector Leon Ashcroft arrived at the estate an hour later, coat dripping, stride steady despite the storm. Known for his unyielding logic and quiet intuition, Ashcroft had solved crimes that others dismissed as unsolvable. But even he paused upon stepping into the study, taking in the details with a practiced gaze. Untouched windows, locked door, still burning lamp, faint smell of lavender. Nothing was out of place, unless you counted the dead woman and the locket that should not have existed. The butler, Mr. Green, waited quietly at the doorway, hands clasped with rigid propriety. "Inspector, everything is exactly as I found it. Mrs. Faraday never permitted anyone inside this room. She always kept it locked, and I keep the duplicate key in my possession at all times." "You unlocked the door?" Ashcroft asked without looking up. "Yes, sir. When she did not come down for dinner, I grew concerned. And the windows, all latched from the inside, as you can see." Ashcroft examined the locket first. The photograph was old, not ancient, but decades past. The inscription troubled him more. "I never forgot" implied a memory, a grievance, a tie between the deceased and the unknown subject of the photo. But why leave the locket here? Why break the chain? If the killer wanted Eloise Faraday dead, why plant a clue that only muddied the waters? He approached the desk. The letter beneath her hand was addressed to no one, its content cryptic. "It seems the past cannot be buried. I fear tonight may be the last time I hold the truth alone. Forgiveness is beyond my reach now. No signature, no explanation." The inspector read the lines twice. Eloise Faraday had known something was coming, something inevitable. Not fear exactly, but resignation. Mr. Green cleared his throat. "Inspector, Mrs. Faraday had no enemies that I know of. Her life has been quiet these last 20 years. Quiet lives often hide the loudest secrets," Ashcroft murmured. "Tell me, who else is in the house?" "Only Miss Clara, her niece. She arrived 3 days ago from London. The family lawyer visits occasionally, but not tonight." Ashcroft pocketed the locket. "Take me to the niece." Clara Faraday waited in the drawing room, pacing before the fire. She was a slender young woman of sharp brows and sharper eyes, her dark gown unwrinkled despite her agitation. When Ashcroft entered, she stopped abruptly and clasped her hands as though trying to contain herself. "Inspector, is it true? My aunt is gone?" "Yes," he replied gently. "I'm sorry, I have some questions." "Of course," she whispered, though her voice trembled in a way that suggested she had expected this. Feared it, perhaps. "Did your aunt mention receiving threats?" "No, but she was unsettled these past few nights. I heard her pacing, talking softly to herself. She wouldn't tell me what worried her." "Did she ever show you a locket?" "Silver, with a broken chain." Clara's expression changed, but only slightly. A flicker of recognition quickly masked. "No," she said too quickly. "I've never seen one." Ashcroft held her gaze. Your aunt wrote something before she died. She believed the past had returned to confront her. Do you know what she meant? Clara swallowed. My aunt lived a life before I was born. She rarely spoke of it. She lost her husband early, and my parents said she withdrew from everything afterwards. Do you know the name Edward Morrow? Her face paled. Where did you... So you do know it. He was someone my aunt knew long ago. I only learned the name by accident from an old correspondence I once found. My aunt dismissed it as nothing. Was he the man in the locket? Clara hesitated again, caught between truth and fear. I think... Yes. He disappeared before I was born. Vanished without explanation. Some said he ran away. Others claimed he died abroad. My aunt never confirmed either. Ashcroft nodded slowly. Your aunt's study was locked. No one entered. No weapon, no struggle. And yet she is dead with a locket beside her. You understand what that implies? Clara's voice dropped to barely a whisper. That someone who could not have entered did. Or, Ashcroft said quietly, that someone who was already inside left no trace. Clara stiffened. You think I had something to do with her death? I think, he replied calmly, that you are withholding something. But before Clara could answer, Mr. Green approached the doorway, pale as parchment. Inspector, there is something else. The safe in Mrs. Faraday's study. It is open. Ashcroft followed him back at once. The safe stood built into the wall beside the bookcase. Eloise Faraday had been meticulous. She did not leave safes open by accident. Yet the steel door hung ajar. Inside lay only one item, an old will, but not the will currently on file. This one was different. It named a sole heir, Edward Morrow. Ashcroft felt the pieces shifting, aligning into a shape he did not yet recognize. The locket, the inscription, the missing man, the rewritten will. Something had haunted Eloise for decades, something she feared enough to hide, something someone else now wanted uncovered. He studied the safe more closely. Dust lay thick across its top edge, except for one narrow, freshly disturbed streak. No fingerprints, no scratches, yet someone had opened it recently. Mr. Green, Ashcroft said, who else knew this safe existed? No one but Mrs. Faraday, and myself, and the niece. Green hesitated. I do not believe so. Ashcroft didn't answer. He picked up the will and folded it carefully. The past had returned indeed, but whose hands carried it? A locked room, a vanished man, a dying confession, and a crime that left no trace, except a locket declaring that something or someone had never forgotten. Ashcroft stepped back, observing the silent study one last time. The crime felt impossibly simple and unbearably complex at once, as though someone had orchestrated it with knowledge far deeper than the present could offer. Whatever haunted this house had not finished speaking. It had merely begun. The rain had eased to a fine drizzle by the time Ashcroft left the study, but the heaviness in the Faraday estate had not lifted. Each room seemed to breathe its own quiet suspicion, and the shadows clung stubbornly to corners where the lamplight dared not reach. As he passed through the drawing room again, Ashcroft's attention was drawn to a small detail that had escaped him before, a faint indentation in the carpet near the fireplace, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor and then removed. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but in his experience, such minutiae were rarely meaningless. Clara, he said, his tone even, yet carrying an unspoken weight, do you ever move furniture in this room? She shook her head, eyes fixed on the fire. No, nothing has been moved for years. He crouched briefly to examine the indentation. The carpet fibers were flattened along a narrow line leading to the hearth. He noticed, too, the faint residue on the polished wood, a trace of ash that did not belong to the fire in the grate. Ashcroft allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Others would dismiss this as trivial, but it whispered of presence, passage, and haste. Mr. Green, Ashcroft said, rising slowly, tell me exactly what you did when you first discovered your mistress. I entered the study, saw her slumped at the desk. I immediately checked for a pulse, called the doctor. His voice faltered slightly, and Ashcroft caught it. You did nothing else? Green hesitated. No, sir. Did you touch anything in the room? The desk, the locket, the letter? "No, sir. Nothing." Ashcroft studied the butler carefully. Green's movements were precise, almost mechanical, his face a mask of composure. Yet there was tension in the fingers that clutched his coat lapels, a rigidity that suggested he was accustomed to hiding more than his presence. Observing the minutiae, the twitch of an eyelid, the brief hesitation before answering, Ashcroft felt the first stirrings of deception. Not outright guilt, not yet, but a subtle dissonance between word and gesture. He returned to the locket lying on the floor, silver, worn, almost modest, yet now it carried a weight beyond its size. Ashcroft turned it over, noticing scratches along the edges, tiny abrasions, consistent with repeated handling. Whoever had left it here had been careful, but in their carefulness they had betrayed a nervousness, an urgency. "Did your aunt ever speak of Edward Morrow directly?" he asked Clara, his eyes sharp. "Never. Only in vague references. She regretted something. Always spoke in riddles." Her voice was tight, constrained, yet Ashcroft noted the subtle tremor, a silent confession of fear, or perhaps guilt. He walked back to the study door, examining the lock. Not the mechanism itself, it was standard, but the alignment of the keyhole and the slight scuffing on the edge of the doorframe. Someone had used the key repeatedly, perhaps on several occasions, and each time left a microscopic trace of wear. A detail invisible to the untrained eye, but meaningful to him. "You noticed this?" he asked, gesturing at the scuff marks. "No," Clara admitted, her eyes wide. "I never paid attention to such things." Ashcroft nodded silently. That, in itself, told him more than she might intend. Few young women, polite and well-bred, studied the minutiae of a locked door, unless driven by curiosity, necessity, or the faintest suspicion of secrets. And yet, here she was, aware enough to notice his gesture. Perhaps she had examined the room before, perhaps under her aunt's watchful eye. He turned back to the indentation in the carpet and followed its subtle line with his gaze. It led, not to the safe, but toward a small, brass-bound chest tucked under the desk. He knelt and inspected the chest closely. The lock appeared forced, yet there was no sign of the heavy tools one might expect. Instead, faint, near-invisible scratches traced the edge of the latch, as though opened delicately with a thin implement. Someone had known exactly how to manipulate it without leaving a trace. Opening the chest carefully, Ashcroft revealed a stack of yellowed papers, tied with a ribbon now fraying at the edges. The handwriting was neat, familiar, yet old-fashioned, matching the style in the letter on the desk. He examined the top sheet, a journal entry dated decades ago. It spoke of debts unpaid, of a love that had faltered, and of someone named Edward who had vanished without explanation. The entry concluded with a chilling line, "If he returns, the past will not forgive me." Ashcroft's eyes flicked to Clara, who watched silently, her face pale. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" he asked. She swallowed hard. It looks like my aunt's, but these entries, I've never seen them before. That may explain the locket," Ashcroft murmured, returning it carefully to the floor. "It appears your aunt feared that Edward Morrow, or someone connected to him, would return to claim what she tried to bury." A sudden thought struck him, and he asked, "Mr. Green, have you noticed anyone lingering near the estate in recent weeks? Strangers, unusual visitors, inquiries about the house?" Green shook his head firmly, though a bead of sweat appeared on his temple. "No, nothing out of the ordinary, sir. The grounds have been empty, apart from servants and the occasional delivery." Ashcroft studied the butler, weighing every micro-expression. Green's denial was smooth, rehearsed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, hesitation, calculation, maybe fear. Nothing overt, nothing that could convict, but enough to make a man like Ashcroft curious. He examined the fireplace again. The ash on the hearth was faint, yet smudged in an unusual pattern, as if something, or someone, had crouched there briefly, perhaps searching or hiding, and that faint trace of dust on the safe, the streak of disturbance, the indentation leading to the chest, all pointed to a sequence invisible to ordinary observers. "Clara," he said, turning his gaze to her, "there is something I must ask. When you arrived 3 days ago, did you ever enter your aunt's study while she was away?" "No," she replied immediately, though her voice wavered. I waited in the drawing room. She was strict about her privacy. Ashcroft nodded, unconvinced. There was truth in her words, certainly, but also a reluctance to disclose something small, seemingly trivial, yet significant. The human mind often lies in omissions as much as in falsehoods, and the more trivial the detail, the more likely it concealed an essential clue. He returned to the locket one last time. Something about the way it lay, broken, yet deliberately placed, spoke to him of intention, of a message encoded in silence. Whoever left it had known it would be found. Whoever moved the chest, handled the journal, manipulated the safe. They had orchestrated a scene with care, with knowledge of how others would react, and with a purpose Ashcroft could not yet decipher. His eyes swept the room once more, absorbing every angle, every shadow, every subtle sign. The locked door, the safe, the brass chest, the locket, the indentation, the traces of ash, all seemed disparate, but he knew better. There was a pattern here, one that required patience, deduction, and a keen eye, and he had both in abundance. The detective straightened, surveying the estate with renewed focus. The first signs of deception were not loud or obvious. They were whispers, half-truths buried beneath layers of propriety and secrecy. But they were there, and he had found them. The unraveling was only just beginning. Somewhere within this quiet, seemingly orderly house lay a truth waiting to assert itself, and Ashcroft intended to uncover it, no matter how carefully it had been hidden. Ashcroft left the study with a deliberate calm, his mind weaving together the threads he had gathered. The house was silent now, save for the soft patter of rain against the tall windows, and each footstep he took across the polished floors seemed to echo in a rhythm that carried him closer to understanding. The investigation demanded patience. The truth would not present itself in blunt force, but in whispers, in hesitations, in contradictions. He returned to the drawing room where Clara waited, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "I will need to speak with everyone who was in the house today," he said, his voice low, precise. "Your observations may help me, but they must be truthful. Every detail matters." Clara nodded, though her expression was taut with unease. "Of course, Inspector, anything to help." First, Ashcroft spoke with Mr. Green, the butler, whose composure seemed unshakable on the surface. Yet Ashcroft had already sensed the subtle signs of restraint, the slight tremor in his hands when discussing the study, the momentary avoidance of eye contact when the locket was mentioned. "Mr. Green," Ashcroft began, "please recount your movements today, from the moment breakfast was cleared until the discovery of Mrs. Faraday." Green straightened and spoke slowly. "I cleared the breakfast room at 8:30. I then ensured that the staff had begun their daily duties. I checked the library, ensured the front gates were secured. Then, seeing Mrs. Faraday had not appeared for luncheon, I proceeded to the study. I found her as you know, sir." Ashcroft nodded, though his gaze lingered on the careful cadence of Green's speech. "Did you notice anything unusual? Visitors, sounds, letters delivered, anything at all?" "No, sir, nothing out of the ordinary." "The household was as usual? And the chest under the desk?" Ashcroft asked softly. "Did you ever handle it?" Green stiffened. "No, I never touched it. My mistress kept it in strict privacy." His tone was quick, almost defensive. Ashcroft allowed the statement to stand for the moment. Truths often revealed themselves in what was said, and in what was withheld. Next he turned to Clara. Her responses were careful, precise, but Ashcroft noticed the subtle tension in her hands, the way she avoided direct eye contact when Edward Morrow's name was mentioned again. "You arrived 3 days ago," he said. "Did you notice anyone visiting the estate? Did you hear your aunt speak of correspondence or unusual inquiries?" Clara shook her head. "No one visited. I was mostly in my room. My aunt spoke little of her past. I tried not to disturb her." She hesitated, then added, almost as an afterthought, "There were nights I heard her talking, quietly, to herself, but I never understood what it was about." Ashcroft observed her closely. "Talking to herself," he murmured. "Do you remember what she said?" "Only fragments," Clara admitted. "Words like forgive, never return, forgotten. I didn't understand. I assumed it was about the past, something she wished to bury." The detective's eyes narrowed slightly. The words were consistent with the letter and the journal entries, yet the timing, The nights Clara had heard them matched the period when Edward Morrow's disappearance would have been a secret most strictly guarded. She had heard enough to grasp significance, yet not enough to understand it, and her reluctance to share more now suggested either fear or loyalty, or perhaps both. Ashcroft called in two of the estate's servants, a maid and a cook, whose testimonies seemed initially mundane. Both spoke of routine tasks, of empty corridors, of quiet mornings and orderly chores. Yet as he asked about the study and Mrs. Faraday's habits, small contradictions emerged. The maid insisted she had not seen the butler enter the study before the discovery, while the cook mentioned catching a glimpse of him passing the door near mid-morning. A minor discrepancy, but in the world of deception, minor discrepancies were often the first cracks in carefully constructed facades. "What about deliveries?" Ashcroft asked the cook. "Any parcels, letters, or packages?" The cook's eyes darted briefly, almost imperceptibly. "There was a package," she said slowly. "It was left at the front door. I don't recall opening it. Mr. Green usually handles them." Ashcroft made a note. A parcel unaccounted for could carry significance, or be a red herring, yet he would not dismiss it. Returning to Green, Ashcroft asked one pointed question. "Did you know about the locket?" Green's composure faltered this time. He swallowed, glanced at Clara, and shook his head. "No, sir, I never saw it before this morning." Yet Ashcroft had observed him handle it during the initial discovery, and the hesitation was telling. A man who is truthful does not pause like that when discussing objects so intimately tied to the deceased. He returned to Clara, focusing on her demeanor. "Your aunt kept many secrets. Do you know if she ever mentioned anyone returning to claim what was lost?" Clara's lips pressed tightly together, as though holding back words she dared not speak. Finally she whispered, "She feared Edward, or someone connected to him. She believed he might come back for what was his. She was never wrong about people she feared." Ashcroft's gaze swept the room. The testimonies were layered, partially overlapping, partially contradictory, yet patterns emerged. Green's restraint, Clara's partial admissions, the servants' fragmented recollections, they all pointed toward a house under the subtle weight of hidden motives. Someone had acted with foresight, someone who knew the precise order of movements, someone who could manipulate what was discovered to serve a particular narrative. He returned to the safe, observing the faint streak in the dust once again. Whoever opened it had done so recently, and the precision suggested a careful, practiced hand. Ashcroft realized that the true manipulator might not be visible at all in the room, might never have been, yet their influence was unmistakable. The crime, the scene, the seemingly trivial details, they were all deliberate, orchestrated to mislead. "People lie," he murmured to himself, "not always from guilt, sometimes from loyalty, sometimes from fear, and sometimes the lie itself is the only clue to the truth." He studied Clara and Green together, noting the delicate balance of power, the unspoken connections. Each word they spoke was measured, each gesture controlled, but Ashcroft could see the tension beneath the surface, the invisible threads of hidden motives. Someone's eagerness to cooperate was almost as telling as someone's reluctance. The detective stepped back, considering the room as a whole, the locked study, the brass chest, the scattered papers, the locket, the safe, the faint indentation in the carpet, and the conflicting accounts of those present. He could feel the deception weaving itself around the truth, a web both delicate and cunning. Ashcroft knew he was on the cusp of uncovering the first layer of the puzzle. The witnesses had spoken, yet not fully. Each answer carried more questions than solutions, each hesitation a hint of deeper secrets. Somewhere in their words, in their movements, in the subtle contradictions, lay the key to understanding how the past had returned to claim the present. And he would find it, one careful observation at a time. The night deepened outside, and the estate seemed to hold its breath. The voices of deception had spoken, and Ashcroft had listened. Now it was time to trace the silent truths they had inadvertently revealed. Ashcroft spent the rest of the evening moving through the Faraday estate with meticulous attention, retracing steps and reconsidering every word, every pause, every gesture he had observed. The storm outside had faded into a soft drizzle. but the house itself remained steeped in tension, a pressure that seemed almost tangible. Each room he passed, each shadow he observed, felt like a piece of the intricate puzzle, some pieces small and easily overlooked, others imposing, commanding attention, yet all connected by a thread he had yet to fully see. He returned to the study, moving quietly so as not to disturb the scene. The brass chest, the safe, and the locket lay exactly as they had been discovered. Ashcroft knelt to examine the safe once more, tracing the faint streak of dust. Whoever had opened it recently had done so with knowledge and precision, someone intimately familiar with its mechanism. That someone had access, not just to the safe, but to the inner workings of the house, and perhaps to the fears and secrets of Mrs. Faraday herself. Clara Faraday entered quietly, her steps hesitant. "Inspector, is there anything I can do to help?" Ashcroft looked up at her, eyes sharp. "Help? Perhaps. But I require absolute honesty. Your aunt's death has left a labyrinth of motives in this house. Everyone, it seems, had a reason to wish her harm, or to protect themselves from consequences she might reveal." Clara swallowed, a shadow crossing her features. "You mean someone wanted her dead because of the will? Possibly," he said, "or because of something even older. Let me be clear, Miss Faraday, I am not accusing anyone yet, but each person here carries a motive, and each motive overlaps with another. It is a maze." He began by considering Mr. Green, the butler. His loyalty was evident, almost overbearing, yet Ashcroft had noted the subtle hesitations, the small discrepancies in his account of the day. Green had known the house inside out, its routines, its secrets. He had handled the parcels, supervised the staff, and maintained the keys. He had access to the safe, to the study, and the brass chest. If someone had intended to alter or uncover the will, Green could facilitate it or prevent it, and in such a position, the temptation of control or greed could not be dismissed. Then there was Clara herself. The niece arrived from London just days before her aunt's death, immediately positioned as the inheritor under the original will. She had both proximity and opportunity, and her demeanor, though outwardly respectful, revealed tension, evasions, and subtle shifts in expression whenever Edward Morrow's name arose. Her knowledge of the past, fragments, whispers, rumors, was incomplete, yet sufficient to provoke fear or curiosity. While grief could explain her behavior, so too could ambition. Ashcroft also considered the broader context. Mrs. Faraday's life had been private, isolated after early tragedies, yet marked by wealth and secrets. The journal he had examined spoke of debts, betrayals, and unfinished business. Edward Morrow had vanished, leaving a void filled by speculation, regret, and perhaps vengeance. If he, or someone acting in his interest, had returned, the motive was clear: reclaim what had been lost, or exact retribution for perceived wrongs. The detective moved through the house again, revisiting each room, mentally cataloguing every clue and inconsistency. The servants had their own subtle roles, the cook's hesitation about the package, the maid's conflicting memory of the butler's movements, the careful choreography of routines, all hinted at knowledge, partial or complete, of the events leading to Mrs. Faraday's death. Fear could motivate concealment, loyalty could obscure truth, greed could inspire manipulation. Each motive was plausible, yet none fully accounted for the locked study, the broken locket, or the altered will. Ashcroft paused at the library, a room lined with heavy volumes that smelled faintly of leather and dust. He recalled a conversation with Clara about her aunt's riddles and references to the past. She had spoken vaguely of nights when her aunt muttered about forgiveness and forgotten debts. These echoes of memory suggested a web of relationships that extended beyond the present. Edward Morrow's disappearance was not merely a footnote. It was a thread running through the fabric of the estate, pulling at loyalties, anxieties, and potential resentments. He reviewed the testimonies once more, mentally cross-referencing alibis with observed behaviors. Green's insistence on having done nothing unusual, Clara's careful wording, the servants' minor inconsistencies, all were threads that, when woven together, suggested a deliberate pattern of concealment. Not all deception was criminal, some was protective, some strategic. but the combination created a labyrinth in which truth was hidden beneath layers of intent and fear. Ashcroft considered the locket again, its inscription simple yet pointed, "I never forgot." Who had left it and why? Was it a message to the aunt, a warning, or a posthumous revelation of guilt? The broken chain suggested a rupture, a deliberate act meant to draw attention. It was not merely a sentimental object, it was a symbol, a statement, and possibly a key to understanding motive. He returned to Clara, studying her silently. "Your aunt feared the past," he said slowly, "and perhaps she feared you might uncover it. But fear alone does not kill. There must be another motive, something tied to what she possessed, what she withheld, and what she feared would be revealed." Clara's hands tightened around each other. "I don't understand. She never wanted to hurt anyone. She only wanted to protect what was left of the family." "Protection can mask many things," Ashcroft replied, "and sometimes, in trying to protect, we provoke the very danger we fear." He considered all possibilities. A returned Edward Morrow, a clandestine manipulation by Green, a niece driven by inheritance, or an opportunistic hand guided by knowledge of the journal and the will. None alone explained every element, the locket, the safe, the chest, the locked study, but the overlapping motives formed a pattern. Each suspect had an interest, each interest intersected with another, and each intersection carried potential for deception, omission, or crime. Ashcroft returned to the study one final time before nightfall. He crouched beside the chest, the safe, the scattered papers. He traced the path of the indentation in the carpet, reviewed the streak in the dust, and considered the locket's position. He noted how each clue connected not just to the physical scene, but to the psychological landscape of the house. Fear, loyalty, ambition, and past wrongs intertwined like the threads of a tapestry, each tugging at the next. In his mind, the maze of motives was beginning to take shape, not a straight path, but a network of choices, opportunities, and fears, each capable of explaining a fragment, yet none sufficient alone. The detective understood that the key to unraveling the mystery lay in understanding these connections, in discerning which motives were genuine, which were manipulated, and which were merely shadows of the past reaching into the present. As the evening deepened, Ashcroft stood in the study, surveying the estate through the rain-streaked windows. Somewhere in this house, behind the measured words of servants, the careful responses of the niece, and the quiet composure of the butler, lay the truth. And every piece of evidence, every contradiction, every hidden fear brought him closer to it. The maze of motives was complex, tangled, and deceptive, but for a mind like his, every maze eventually revealed a path. The storm outside had cleared, leaving the night wet and cold, the estate cloaked in shadows. Inside, Ashcroft felt the first stirrings of clarity amidst the confusion. The threads of greed, fear, loyalty, and revenge had been revealed. Now it was a matter of tracing their intersections, following the silent signals, and seeing where the truth, obscured, elusive, but present, would lead him. Ashcroft left the study with the first pale light of dawn creeping through the tall windows. The estate was still shrouded in shadows, but already there was a quiet bustle of servants beginning their duties, unaware that the night had harbored secrets far darker than routine chores. As he descended the main staircase, he found Inspector Rowland and two constables waiting in the hall, files in hand, and expressions bright with premature satisfaction. "Good morning, Ashcroft," Rowland greeted, his tone almost triumphant. "We've reviewed the locket, the altered will, and the safe. It's straightforward, really. The evidence points toward Miss Faraday. She had motive, opportunity, and knowledge. Frankly, we can close this today." Ashcroft's eyes did not leave Rowland's face. "You're declaring closure without considering context," he said evenly, "and without examining every angle. A motive is rarely proof, Inspector. Opportunity rarely tells the whole story." Rowland waved a dismissive hand. "You've been at this all night. Let me handle the paperwork while you follow the threads. But really the path is clear." Ashcroft allowed them to leave, returning to the study where the chest, the papers, and the locket waited like silent witnesses. He ran his fingers across the desk, noting faint smudges in the ink, almost imperceptible fingerprints not yet analyzed. He moved to the chest under the desk, carefully lifting the tied bundle of journal entries. Their neat, consistent handwriting, their careful concealment, and the repeated references to Edward Morrow painted a picture that seemed to support Roland's theory: someone close, someone with access, someone motivated by inheritance and curiosity. He examined the locket once more. The inscription, "I never forgot," was deliberate, intentional, almost taunting. Whoever left it had intended for it to be discovered, yet the way it had been placed, along with the broken chain, suggested a hand that was not hurried but precise. Someone who knew the sequence of discovery, who understood the reactions it would provoke, and who anticipated the authorities' simplistic conclusions. Ashcroft's gaze fell on Clara, standing in the doorway, hands folded, tension still evident despite the morning light. "It seems convenient, doesn't it?" he murmured aloud, more to himself than to her. "Everything points neatly toward a single culprit. But life, and certainly death, is rarely so tidy." Clara's voice trembled slightly. You think it's not me, it's not that simple," Ashcroft replied. "I think the apparent solution is a shadow, a misdirection designed to satisfy the unobservant. The true orchestrator is still in the room, figuratively if not physically." He began pacing the study, noting the faint streak in the dust along the safe, the indentation in the carpet leading to the chest, the papers that seemed deliberately arranged yet left subtle inconsistencies. Each detail told a story of calculation, of someone planting evidence, manipulating discovery, and anticipating conclusions. The scenario had been constructed to appear as though Clara, the eager niece, had acted on opportunity and ambition. But the subtle cues, the untouched brass chest, the lack of fingerprints on the safe's handle, the careful placement of the locket, spoke of another hand entirely, one expert in deception. Ashcroft returned to the locket, turning it over in his fingers. He had noticed scratches along the edges before, minor abrasions consistent with repeated handling. Whoever had left it here was careful, yet careless enough to leave these subtle marks. Not mistakes. They were signals, clues to the observant mind, a breadcrumb trail meant to lure the inexperienced detective toward a convenient target. He walked to the window, gazing down at the estate grounds still glistening with morning dew. Outside, nothing moved except for the occasional gardener tending to shrubs. Oblivious to the tensions within, Ashcroft's thoughts returned to Edward Morrow. The journal entries, the altered will, the repeated warnings in Mrs. Faraday's notes, all pointed to a past that had been meticulously concealed, and someone, somewhere, had been waiting, watching, orchestrating every move to ensure that the eventual revelation appeared simple, solvable, and satisfying to the authorities. A sudden knock at the door drew him from his reverie. Clara entered again, holding a small package she claimed to have found hidden behind a loose panel in her aunt's bedroom. Inside was a letter, yellowed and brittle, addressed to no one in particular. Its content was chilling. It referenced debts unpaid, promises broken, and a return long anticipated. The handwriting was not her aunt's. It was deliberate, precise, and unflinching, a signature of someone who had waited decades to settle old scores. Ashcroft read the letter carefully. The tone, the phrasing, and the threats it carried revealed something more than mere greed or familial ambition. It was personal. The writer had a history with Mrs. Faraday, a grievance carried in silence, nurtured and sharpened over decades. Whoever had written this letter had the patience of a predator, the cunning to manipulate the environment, and the foresight to use others as shields for their own actions. He held the letter up, watching Clara's reaction. Her face remained pale, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "You knew nothing of this?" he asked. "No," she whispered. I swear, I never saw it before." Ashcroft nodded slowly, sensing the subtle tremor of fear in her tone. She spoke truthfully, or at least as truthfully as she could, but the letter, the altered will, the planted locket, they were all pieces of a performance, designed to mislead, to point suspicion toward the most convenient suspect. Clara was a convenient suspect, eager to inherit, inexperienced in the darker currents of her aunt's past. She fit neatly into the narrative the true criminal wanted constructed. Ashcroft returned to the study, pacing between the desk, the chest, and the safe. He reviewed each piece of evidence with the precision of a watchmaker, examining inconsistencies invisible to all but the most observant. The safe's streaked dust, the chest's minor scratches, the locket's broken chain, the letter's phrasing, all were too deliberate to be coincidental. The scene had been orchestrated with care, designed to allow authorities to declare victory, to close the case neatly, to distract from the true culprit hiding in plain sight. By mid-morning, Roland had arrived with a team of constables, ready to act on what he believed was a breakthrough. Ashcroft accompanied them into the study, observing as Roland carefully recounted the evidence against Clara. The authorities nodded, satisfied with the apparent clarity. Clara's reaction was as expected, a mix of confusion, fear, and a quiet resignation born of realizing she was the target of misdirected suspicion. Yet, as the constables prepared to take statements, Ashcroft felt the subtle unease that had shadowed him since the discovery of the locket. The narrative made sense superficially, but the deeper currents, the precision of the misdirection, the faint signs of orchestration, the deliberate placement of clues, refused to align with a simple, convenient resolution. The true criminal remained unobserved, silent, and patient. The authorities were ready to close the case, yet the detective knew better. The real danger had only shifted, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike again. Ashcroft stepped back from the group, observing Clara, the butler, the room itself. Every detail was a whisper of the truth concealed beneath layers of deception. And though the early breakthrough seemed to promise closure, he understood that the real story, the story that would reveal the murderer, remained unspoken, lurking in corners, in silences, in calculated omissions. He pocketed the locket and the letter, his mind turning over every subtle trace, every contradiction, every hesitation. The case had a false victory, a veneer of clarity, but the maze of motives, opportunities, and past grievances was far from resolved. Somewhere within the house, or perhaps beyond it, was the hand that had orchestrated this tragedy, the mind that had anticipated every move, and the patience to wait while the world declared the mystery solved. Ashcroft's eyes scanned the estate one final time as he left the study. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the grounds slick, reflective, and eerily quiet. The shadows within the house had not receded, they had merely shifted. And the detective, patient and unyielding, knew that the true culprit was still very much present, hidden behind the surface of appearances, waiting for the moment when the final revelation would emerge. Ashcroft spent the next afternoon poring over old Faraday family records, journals, and correspondence stored in the estate's private archives. The storm had finally passed, leaving a damp, sunlit calm over the grounds, but inside, the house seemed to pulse with the memory of past secrets. Every room he passed, every paper he turned, carried a faint echo of lives shaped by fear, ambition, and unspoken grievances. It was in a small, dust-choked ledger, forgotten for decades, that he found the first thread connecting the past to the present. The ledger contained entries regarding the management of the estate in the 1920s, financial dealings, disputes over inheritance, and mentions of Edward Morrow. The young man had not vanished in isolation. He had been part of a complicated network of promises, betrayals, and debts that implicated members of the household across generations. Ashcroft's eyes lingered over a note indicating a disputed loan, with Green's father named as a guarantor. A name that had once seemed irrelevant now carried weight. Ashcroft leaned back, absorbing the implications. The case was no longer a simple matter of inheritance or a single act of vengeance. The threads of past misdeeds had been woven into the present, shaping motives that spanned decades. The locket, the altered will, the subtle signs of orchestration, they were all part of a pattern carefully concealed within the family's history. He called Clara to the archives, asking her to examine the ledger. She hesitated, recognizing some of the names, though the connections eluded her. "I never knew my aunt kept such detailed records," she said softly. I thought she only kept personal journals. Her personal journals contained emotion, Ashcroft replied, but the ledger contains evidence of relationships, obligations, and hidden enmities. Look here, do you see the connection to Mr. Green's family? Clara peered closely, her eyes widening. I think I understand. This isn't just about me or the will. Someone else, someone much older, has a reason for all of this. Yes, Ashcroft murmured. Green may appear merely loyal, but his family has ties to unresolved debts and disputes. Edward Morrow's disappearance, your aunt's secrecy, and the orchestration of the scene all fit into a sequence designed to manipulate perception. It's a pattern that spans decades, and it implicates more than one generation. The detective's mind returned to the journal, the locket, and the letter discovered earlier. Each had been carefully constructed, placed to mislead observers while hinting at truths known only to those who understood the full scope of history. The author of the letter had anticipated reactions, and now, with the ledger as a key, Ashcroft could begin tracing the deeper web of connections. He summoned Mr. Green to the archives, observing the butler's reaction carefully as the ledger was spread across the table. Green's fingers flexed, almost imperceptibly, and his eyes flicked toward Clara before settling on Ashcroft. I don't understand, sir. These records are old. They have nothing to do with today. Ashcroft's gaze was steady. They have everything to do with today. They reveal connections, obligations, and grievances that persist through generations. Do you recognize your father's involvement in Edward Morrow's disappearance? Green's composure shifted slightly. My father, he was involved in family affairs. That was long ago. I had no part in it. That may be true, Ashcroft said, but the patterns he established remain. The influence, the knowledge, and the expectations he set in motion affect how events unfold today. Someone is using those old connections, that history, to manipulate circumstances now, and you, intentionally or not, are part of that continuum. Clara leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper. You mean the crime wasn't just personal, it was historical? Precisely, Ashcroft said. The past has returned to shape the present. The locket, the altered will, the hidden letter, they are all tools, deliberately used to construct a narrative that satisfies the unobservant. But history leaves traces, even when carefully concealed, and the ledger is one of those traces. He studied both of them closely, noting subtle expressions of fear, hesitation, and acknowledgement. Green's face, so meticulously composed before, now betrayed the faintest signs of recognition, as if he understood that the past was not as distant as he had believed. Clara's wide eyes reflected a dawning comprehension of forces she had only partially understood. Decades of hidden debts, family obligations, and secrets that had silently shaped her aunt's life and, ultimately, her death. Ashcroft turned back to the ledger, tracing the entries once more. He found a series of correspondences detailing disputes over Edward Morrow's inheritance and the estate's finances, each entry linked to multiple household members, including the butler's family. The overlapping obligations, promises, and grudges formed a tangled web. The apparent simplicity of the crime, an inheritance dispute, a broken locket, a locked study, was a veneer masking a far more intricate reality. He considered the locket again. Its inscription, "I never forgot," now took on a more profound meaning. It was not merely a message of personal revenge or familial grievance. It was a signal to those who understood the history, a reminder that unresolved matters from decades past could ripple forward, shaping behavior and influencing outcomes. Whoever orchestrated the crime was acutely aware of these historical connections and had used them to engineer a scenario that would mislead the authorities and manipulate perception. Ashcroft paused, reflecting on Clara's position. She was an unwitting participant, caught in a current that had been set in motion long before her arrival. Yet the true manipulator, the mind orchestrating events, aware of both historical grievances and present opportunities, remained unseen, deliberately concealed behind layers of deception. The crime was no longer just a product of immediate motives like inheritance or fear. It was rooted in a continuum of past obligations, revenge, and meticulously nurtured resentment. As he considered the full scope of the case, Ashcroft realized the importance of timing. The manipulator had planned every step carefully, anticipating reactions, planting evidence, and allowing the authorities to pursue false leads. The early breakthrough, the false victory, had been entirely predictable, yet it was precisely this predictability that revealed the intelligence and patience behind the crime. He closed the ledger gently, standing and surveying the room. The shadows of the past had shifted the investigation, illuminating connections and motives that had been overlooked. The crime, which had seemed solvable through immediate evidence and testimony, now demanded understanding of decades-long histories, subtle alliances, and concealed grievances. The true culprit was not merely someone present in the house today. They were a product of, and participant in, a historical web, carefully designed to protect secrets and exploit vulnerabilities. Ashcroft turned to Clara and Green. "We are not dealing with a simple inheritance dispute. We are dealing with a story written across generations, where history has dictated actions, fears, and decisions. Understanding that story is essential if we are to uncover the person who orchestrated this tragedy. The crime is far more complex than it appeared, and the past has left unmistakable traces for those willing to see them." The room was quiet, filled only with the soft sound of the wind brushing against the window panes. Outside, the estate seemed peaceful, almost serene, but within, the tension of long-buried secrets stirred. Ashcroft understood that to solve the case, he would have to trace every thread back through time, to untangle the intricate network of obligations, resentments, and hidden alliances that had converged to produce the events of the night before. The detective knew that the shadows of the past were not merely echoes. They were active participants, shaping every action, influencing every motive, and guiding the hands that had orchestrated the scene. The locket, the letter, the ledger, they were all fragments of a story centuries in the making, and Ashcroft, patient, methodical, and unyielding, would follow those fragments wherever they led, until the truth, long concealed by time and cunning, was finally revealed. Ashcroft spent the remainder of the day in contemplative silence, moving between the study, the drawing room, and the archives. Every paper, ledger, and letter he had examined now existed in a mental map, a web of motives, obligations, and concealed histories. Yet, despite the clarity that history provided, the identity of the true orchestrator remained elusive. The pieces of the puzzle were present, but the final spark, the unconventional clue that could expose the hidden hand, had yet to appear. He returned to the study just as dusk began to filter through the tall windows, painting the room in muted amber light. The chest, the papers, the locket, and the safe all stood as silent witnesses to events meticulously designed to mislead. Ashcroft's eyes rested on Clara and Green, seated across from each other, both tense, both aware that the detective was no ordinary observer. He needed more than testimonies or circumstantial evidence. He needed a reaction, a slip, a subtle fracture in the mask of composure that concealed the truth. A thought crystallized. He rose and approached the safe, pretending to examine its exterior. "You know," he said aloud, though with an air of casual reflection, "many believe that wealth and secrecy travel together easily, but often one cannot maintain secrecy without visible oversight." He glanced at Green, watching carefully. "It's fascinating how people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. Sometimes they even confess without realizing it." Green's eyes flickered, but he controlled his expression. Clara's gaze, however, lingered on Ashcroft with a quiet curiosity, her hands pressed tightly in her lap. Ashcroft let the moment stretch, allowing tension to build without speaking further. The silence became almost a character in the room, pressing against the careful facades, inviting them to reveal themselves. "Mr. Green," he continued, pacing slowly, "if someone had been careful, knowledgeable, and patient, and yet left an object, a locket perhaps, intentionally for discovery, what would that imply to you?" Green's hand twitched slightly, his composure flickering for a heartbeat before returning. "It would imply someone who wants to be found out," he said cautiously. "Or someone who wants you to believe they want to be found out," Ashcroft said softly. The detective's eyes met Green's. Deception is rarely simple. It relies on expectation, misdirection, and the subtle manipulation of those who believe themselves observant. Green nodded, slow and deliberate, as if weighing his words carefully. Ashcroft allowed the tension to settle, then introduced his unconventional tactic. He reached for a small, unassuming bundle of paper, a notebook he had kept during his observations of the household. In it were the minor inconsistencies, hesitations, and contradictions he had noticed in every interaction. "I've catalogued small details," he said, placing the notebook on the desk. "Footprints, smudges, gestures, hesitations. I am fascinated by the human tendency to repeat patterns unconsciously. Sometimes, a person will reveal more than they intend when they are asked to reconstruct a sequence in detail." He looked directly at Green. "I want you to describe, step by step, everything you did the morning of Mrs. Faraday's death, from waking until the discovery. Include the smallest actions. Your focus will help me understand the sequence and perhaps the rhythm of events that night." Green straightened, eyes narrowing slightly, yet he complied, speaking with measured cadence. He recounted clearing breakfast, supervising the staff, checking the gates, his visit to the study, and the discovery of the body. At first, his narrative flowed smoothly, almost rehearsed, yet Ashcroft noticed a subtle irregularity. Each mention of passing near the desk or the chest was accompanied by a brief pause, a slight stiffening of the shoulders, a flicker of the eyes. Small, almost imperceptible signals, but enough for Ashcroft to mark them mentally. "Did you touch the chest?" Ashcroft asked casually, as if musing aloud. No, I did not," Green said instantly, but the flicker of hesitation returned, longer this time. "And the locket?" Green's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. He blinked rapidly, glanced at Clara, then returned his eyes to Ashcroft. I may have moved it, accidentally, but I did not mean anything by it." Ashcroft nodded, concealing the significance of the reaction. The subtle crack in Green's controlled demeanor was exactly what he had anticipated. The unusual tactic, forcing a detailed reconstruction under a casual conversational guise, had prompted an involuntary reaction. The pause, the blink, the micro-expression, all told a story Green had tried to conceal. He turned his attention to Clara, his tone shifting slightly, still conversational but probing. "And you, Miss Faraday, when you entered the study after your aunt was found, did you notice anything that might have seemed out of place, even subtly? The position of objects, the way the room was arranged?" Clara hesitated, then leaned forward. "The locket. It was on the floor, broken. I thought it had fallen. But now, perhaps it was meant to be found that way. And the chest, the papers were tidy, more than I would have expected, but some were slightly askew. It seemed deliberate." Ashcroft allowed the insight to settle. The combination of Green's subtle reaction and Clara's fresh observation painted a picture more coherent than anything Roland or the constables could assemble from mere documents and testimonies. The unusual tactic, asking for detailed reconstruction, had forced the suspects to interact with the evidence in a manner that revealed hidden truths. He moved to the locket, lifting it gently. "Intent can be revealed in small acts," he said softly. "Not in what is done, but in what is left behind. The careful placement, the subtle misalignment, the faint scratches, each speaks of calculation, and calculation, when combined with a reaction, exposes the architect of the design." Green's hands clenched briefly in his lap, a small involuntary sign of tension. Clara's eyes widened slightly, understanding the implication but not yet the full scope. Ashcroft had observed the unconsciously betraying gesture. It confirmed his suspicion that the butler's role was more than passive loyalty. Someone had orchestrated events with an intimate understanding of the house, its history, and the predictable responses of those within it. "Patterns repeat," Ashcroft murmured, addressing the room as a whole. "Old grievances, obligations, and knowledge guide actions in ways people cannot fully control. And when you force someone to reconstruct their movements under pressure, their true relationship to the events often emerges." Green's composure returned, though faintly strained, his earlier crack now a subtle marker Ashcroft would exploit. The detective catalogued every gesture, every hesitation, every fleeting micro-expression, knowing that the conventional evidence, the locket, the chest, the altered will, was insufficient alone. The unconventional clue was not a document or a fingerprint. It was the human reaction, the involuntary truth that escaped even the most disciplined restraint. Ashcroft leaned back, his mind already piecing together the implications. The crime was layered, and the evidence had been meticulously staged to mislead, yet the psychological test he had applied had produced a spontaneous revelation. Green had responded differently than Clara, differently than the others, and the difference spoke volumes. The subtle fissure in composure, invisible to the casual observer, was the key to unraveling the deeper orchestration that connected the past, the present, and the carefully constructed scene of deception. He placed the locket down and regarded both of them calmly. "The truth is patient," he said softly, "and it often waits until the right moment, revealed not by force but by observation, subtlety, and understanding the mind behind the actions. And now we have begun to see it." Outside, the dusk deepened into evening, casting long shadows across the estate. Within, the interplay of history, motive, and deception had produced the first tangible revelation. The unconventional clue had emerged, not from the scene itself, nor from documents or letters, but from the human response, the involuntary signal that betrayed the careful orchestration hidden behind layers of propriety and apparent innocence. Ashcroft knew that the next steps would build upon this insight, guiding him closer to the individual who had manipulated the past to orchestrate the present. Ashcroft spent the evening meticulously reviewing the ledger, the locket, and the journal entries once more, trying to assemble a complete timeline of events. The unconventional clue had given him a foothold, a subtle psychological insight into Green's involvement, yet he knew that insight alone would not be enough to unravel the full scheme. The house was quiet now, almost oppressively so, each shadow seeming to watch him as he moved between rooms. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows, reminded him that he was not the only one aware of the investigation's progress. As he reached for the notebook where he had recorded the inconsistencies and reactions of the household, a sudden chill ran through the room. Something was off. The notebook, carefully placed on the study desk moments before, was gone. Ashcroft's heart quickened, not with fear but with the sharp clarity of recognition. Someone had entered, unnoticed, and taken the single item that contained the most critical observations, the one tool capable of connecting behavioral anomalies to physical evidence. He examined the desk carefully. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. The notebook had been removed with precision by someone who knew exactly what it contained and why it was vital. This was no ordinary theft. It was a targeted attempt to bury the truth before the detective could fully expose it. Ashcroft's mind raced. Who had the knowledge and opportunity to enter unnoticed? Who had the patience and cunning to anticipate the notebook's importance? Green immediately came to mind, but he also considered Clara. Yet Clara's reactions had been honest, revealing only what she had observed. The butler, on the other hand, had shown subtle signs of stress when the notebook's psychological analysis was discussed. He called Green to the study, his tone calm but firm. "Mr. Green, the notebook is missing," Ashcroft stated simply. "Do you know anything about its disappearance?" Green's face remained impassive, yet his fingers flexed slightly, betraying the smallest crack in his composure. "No, sir, I cannot imagine who would remove it," he said, his voice measured, but the hesitation was unmistakable. Ashcroft observed him closely, noting the subtle shift in posture, the micro-expression of surprise that didn't quite align with genuine ignorance. He decided to employ a careful tactic, presenting information in a way that would provoke a reaction from the guilty party without directly accusing them. "I had recorded every observation of your actions and those of the household during the discovery of Mrs. Faraday," Ashcroft said slowly, pacing before the window. "Every pause, every hesitation, every minor contradiction. I intended to compare them against the physical evidence, to see who might have manipulated the scene. Now that this notebook is gone, it will be difficult to make the necessary connections." Green's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Ashcroft, a barely perceptible tightening of the jaw. I assure you, sir, I have not touched it. Whoever did, it was opportunistic, perhaps careless. Ashcroft nodded, his mind racing. The theft itself was deliberate, yet it revealed the thief's priorities and anxiety. The person responsible was desperate to prevent the detective from connecting the subtle dots, to halt the investigation before the carefully constructed narrative could be dismantled. He turned his attention to Clara, who had been quietly observing. "Miss Faraday, did you see anyone near the study while I was reviewing the notebooks?" Clara shook her head. "No, Inspector. I was in my room most of the evening. The house was silent. I didn't notice anyone unusual." Ashcroft made a mental note. Her testimony aligned with what he had observed. Clara had no motive for removing the notebook, and her presence elsewhere corroborated her innocence. That narrowed the field further, and Green's earlier reactions now appeared more significant. He examined the study for subtle signs of intrusion, disturbed dust, faint scuff marks on the polished floor, a slight misalignment of the papers on the desk. Each clue suggested someone had acted carefully but with urgency, someone accustomed to the house, familiar with its rhythms, confident in their ability to avoid detection. Ashcroft's eyes fell on the safe. The streak of dust he had observed before now seemed more critical than ever. Whoever had taken the notebook had likely passed by it, or even handled it, leaving the faintest mark. He crouched, brushing lightly along the streak, imagining the hand that had lifted the notebook with precise care. It was a trace, almost invisible, yet it confirmed the presence of a manipulator within the house's inner circle. He considered the timing. The notebook had disappeared sometime between his last deliberate observation and the present moment, a window of opportunity narrow enough to suggest an insider, someone who had been watching and waiting. This was no random theft. It was a calculated strike against the investigation itself. Ashcroft straightened, his mind assembling the implications. The stakes had risen. The subtle cracks he had observed in Green's behavior, combined with the deliberate removal of evidence, painted a clear picture. Someone was actively working to protect themselves, manipulating the investigation from within, and prepared to take bold measures to prevent discovery. The criminal was no longer passive. They were aware, adaptive, and dangerously proactive. He left the study and moved through the house, checking each room for overlooked entrances or exits. There were none. The thief had intimate knowledge of the estate, knew when the detective would be distracted, and could move with near invisibility. The level of cunning required confirmed Ashcroft's suspicion. This was the same mind that had orchestrated the initial crime, guided by knowledge of the past and careful anticipation of the present. Returning to the study, he addressed Green again, his voice controlled yet firm. "The notebook is missing, Mr. Green. Whoever removed it acted deliberately, and I suspect someone within the household is trying to impede the investigation. There are two possibilities. Either you will assist me in recovering it, or the absence of this evidence will be used against you, should it be found elsewhere." Green's hand tightened around the edge of the chair. I will help, sir. If it means clearing my name, of course." I swear I did not remove it." Ashcroft studied him closely, noting both the overt words and the subtle tension. Green's offer of assistance could be genuine, or it could be another layer of deception. Either way, it provided a means to observe further behavior, to draw the individual into revealing themselves through action rather than words. He turned to Clara. "Miss Faraday, I will need your cooperation as well. Someone within the household has shown a willingness to act decisively to conceal evidence. Every movement, every interaction may now carry additional significance. Pay attention, watch closely." The evening drew on, and the house settled into an uneasy quiet. The theft had shifted the dynamics. Trust was now fragile, suspicion heightened, and the invisible tension between the detective, the butler, and the niece created an atmosphere charged with anticipation. Ashcroft knew the removal of the notebook was not merely a setback. It was a signal that the perpetrator was aware of his progress, that they were watching, and that they would act again if necessary. Yet he also knew that every calculated move by the criminal left traces, whether physical, behavioral, or psychological. The vanishing evidence was a challenge, but it also illuminated the mind behind the crime. The subtle cracks, the micro-expressions, the deliberate omissions, they were all part of the trail, and Ashcroft, patient and observant, would follow them. By the time night had fully descended, the detective had reconstructed the possible paths for the notebook's removal, observed Green's reactions in detail, and noted the invisible choreography of deceit within the house. The case had become more perilous, more intricate, and more urgent. Yet in the shadows cast by the vanishing evidence, Ashcroft glimpsed the path forward, the thread that would ultimately unravel the scheme and expose the hidden hand that had manipulated both the past and the present. The house was silent, but Ashcroft sensed movement in the unseen layers of the household, the faint stirrings of a criminal mind anticipating the next step. The investigation had gained momentum, but the stakes had risen. The true mastermind was aware, active, and waiting, and Ashcroft, as always, would be ready. Ashcroft awoke before dawn, the house unusually still, save for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. The notebook's disappearance had left him restless, each shadow in the corridor seeming to stretch toward him with silent warning. He had spent the previous night reviewing every reaction, every hesitation, every subtle micro-expression that Green and Clara had displayed during his unconventional questioning. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the picture remained incomplete, and now there was no guarantee the criminal would remain patient. The first sign of disruption came in the drawing room. Ashcroft had gone to retrieve his coat when he noticed the faintest disturbance. A chair slightly askew, a book lying face down, its pages ruffled. He frowned and knelt, observing a trace of smudged fingerprints along the edge of the fireplace mantel. Not the faint, calculated signs of the previous night, but something more hurried, more deliberate. Someone had been there recently, possibly watching, possibly testing the detective's movements. Before he could investigate further, a shrill scream cut through the quiet corridors, echoing off the polished wood and stone walls. Ashcroft ran toward the source, heart pounding, mind alert to every possible scenario. The scream came again, high-pitched and urgent, followed by a crash, then silence. He reached the library to find Clara standing at the doorway, trembling, eyes wide. On the floor lay a figure, one of the estate's long-serving maids, unconscious but breathing, a heavy book beside her head. Papers were scattered across the floor as if knocked aside in a struggle. Ashcroft knelt immediately, checking for injuries. Bruises, yes, but no immediate life-threatening harm. He helped Clara steady the maid as she regained her senses, murmuring confused words about shadows, movement, and someone hiding in the corridors. "Did you see who did this?" Ashcroft asked, his voice low but urgent. Clara shook her head. "No, I only saw a shadow, someone slipping away." Ashcroft's mind worked quickly. The second incident was deliberate, a warning, a misdirection, a way to rattle the household. The criminal had not acted recklessly. The attack had been swift, precise, leaving enough ambiguity to confuse investigators while demonstrating capability and control. Whoever orchestrated the first crime, the manipulation of evidence and human behavior, was still several steps ahead, now escalating in both boldness and risk. He returned the maid to the sitting area and instructed Clara to stay close. Then he began retracing the route the assailant had likely taken, noting every window, door, and shadowed corridor. No forced entry was apparent. Every access point had been within the control of the household, suggesting that the perpetrator was intimately familiar with the estate's layout, its routines, and its vulnerabilities. Ashcroft's thoughts returned to Green. The butler's earlier micro-expressions, the subtle crack under pressure, the hurried removal of the notebook, all indicated someone methodical, someone comfortable with manipulation and concealment. Green had access, knowledge, and motive. Yet Ashcroft knew that assuming guilt outright would be premature. The second incident might have been orchestrated to implicate him or to further confuse the narrative. He paused at the study doorway, surveying the room for signs overlooked in the initial frenzy. The safe remained untouched, the chest in its place, and the locket lay where he had last observed it. Yet the dust along the floor hinted at movement, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone present in the house at that moment. Ashcroft crouched, tracing the faint impressions, committing every detail to memory. The attack had another implication: urgency. The perpetrator knew Ashcroft was close to a breakthrough. The unconventional clue, the behavioral analysis, the subtle micro-expressions, they had been observed, catalogued, and acted upon. The second crime demonstrated not recklessness, but awareness, adaptability, and an intention to escalate. Ashcroft understood that solving the initial mystery alone was no longer sufficient. He now had to anticipate the next move, protect potential victims, and force the criminal into error. He gathered Clara in the study. "Someone is manipulating events with precision and patience," he said. "The notebook's disappearance and this assault indicate an intelligence aware of our progress. We must act deliberately, predict patterns, and observe without revealing our intentions. The criminal is counting on panic, distraction, or misdirection to maintain the advantage." Clara's hands trembled slightly, but she nodded. "I understand, Inspector. I will stay vigilant." Ashcroft considered the ledger once more, tracing the historical connections he had uncovered. Edward Morrow's disappearance, the old debts, the overlapping grievances, all pointed toward a continuity of motive across generations. Yet the present danger indicated that someone had not only knowledge of history, but the capacity to exploit it for immediate gain. He returned to Green, who had been summoned quietly to the study under Ashcroft's calm yet commanding instructions. "Mr. Green," Ashcroft began, voice measured, "you are aware of every movement in this house, as well as its history. Someone has escalated their actions, threatening life and evidence alike. Tell me, what do you know that could clarify the situation?" Green's composure remained taut, but Ashcroft noticed the imperceptible shift in his stance, the faint narrowing of the eyes. I know nothing, sir. I have always served loyally, as you know. I would never interfere." Ashcroft studied him carefully, recalling the subtle micro-expression, the previous flicker of tension, the timing of the notebook's disappearance, the attack on the maid, and Green's access all intersected. Yet Green's loyalty, while possibly genuine, did not preclude manipulation by another. Ashcroft realized that the true orchestrator might be using Green's predictability and presence as a shield, creating a smokescreen of loyalty to mask malevolent intent. He moved to a window, surveying the darkening estate grounds. There were no signs of movement outside, yet he knew better than to trust appearances. The criminal had proven capable of anticipating observations, exploiting both human behavior and physical knowledge of the estate. Ashcroft's approach had to become even more subtle, provoking reaction without revealing intent, observing behavior without invitation, and setting a trap within the confines of the household itself. As night settled fully, the detective reflected on the sequence of events. The first crime had been meticulously orchestrated. The notebook had vanished to impede observation, and now a deliberate assault had raised the stakes. The villain was no longer hidden behind simple misdirection. They were active, aware, and willing to escalate to protect themselves. Ashcroft knew the investigation had shifted from mere deduction to anticipation. The challenge was no longer only solving the original crime, it was preventing another, and doing so while maneuvering within a complex web of history, loyalty, and deception. He returned to the study, watching both Green and Clara carefully, cataloguing subtle expressions, minute gestures, and unspoken reactions. Every detail now carried critical weight. The vanishing notebook and the assault had transformed the investigation from a search for hidden motives to a contest of intellect and foresight. Ashcroft realized the criminal was orchestrating a narrative in real time, manipulating events, anticipating reactions, and setting traps not only for the household, but for the detective himself. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the estate bathed in moonlight. Within, tension coiled and twisted, and Ashcroft, patient, calculating, and ever observant, understood that the next hours would determine not just the resolution of the crime, but the very survival of those ensnared by the manipulations of a mind both cunning and relentless. The unexpected twist had arrived, and the investigation had become a race against a shadow that moved with terrifying precision. Ashcroft paced the study, the moonlight slanting across the floorboards and casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the twisting paths of the investigation. The second incident, the attack on the maid, had escalated the tension, forcing him to reassess his understanding of the criminal. He reviewed every observation he had made: Green's micro-expressions, Clara's genuine reactions, the missing notebook, and the subtle discrepancies in the placement of objects around the study. Each piece, once isolated, seemed insignificant, but Ashcroft sensed that, together, they were beginning to form a larger design. He returned to the locket, lying where he had last seen it. Its inscription, "I never forgot," was more than a message, it was part of the choreography. He traced his finger along the broken edges and noted the scratches, the fingerprints, the faint smudge that suggested it had been handled not once but multiple times in careful, deliberate sequence. It was an object designed to mislead, to signal, and to manipulate perception all at once. Ashcroft recalled Green's hesitation when asked about the locket during the unconventional questioning. At the time, it seemed a small detail, a pause, a blink, but in conjunction with the theft of the notebook and the attack on the maid, it now took on a new weight. The seemingly trivial moments, gestures, and actions of those in the household were not random, they were elements in a pattern the criminal had established to control how the investigation unfolded. He stood silently for a moment, letting the stillness of the house settle around him. And then it struck him. The comment Clara had made about the papers in the chest being slightly askew, the maid's whispered mention of shadows moving through the corridors, Green's subtle micro-expression when the notebook was mentioned, they were not anomalies, they were deliberate signals, part of a consistent behavior the orchestrator relied upon to mislead observers while maintaining control. The pattern was not in the objects themselves, nor in the obvious motives, it was in the manipulation of perception, in the choreography of human response. Ashcroft moved to the fireplace mantel and examined the smudges he had noticed earlier. One in particular seemed oddly deliberate, a streak of dust along the edge, almost forming a line that led directly toward the bookshelf, where several books appeared to have been shifted slightly from their usual positions. He reached up and ran his fingers along the spines, feeling a subtle irregularity, a small gap between volumes that, at first glance, was easily dismissed. It was as if someone had intentionally left a clue in plain sight, relying on the expectation that the ordinary observer would not question it. He removed the books carefully and discovered a folded note wedged behind them. The paper was yellowed, corners frayed, and the handwriting familiar, precise, deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested patience and calculation. The note referenced the estate's old grievances, Morrow's disappearance, and the overlapping debts recorded in the ledger. But it also included something more, a series of initials, seemingly random, but matching the sequence of entries Green's father had made decades earlier. The connection between past and present, between behavior and objects, between the hidden manipulations and the overt appearances, was suddenly unmistakable. Ashcroft straightened, eyes narrowing as the pieces aligned in his mind. The criminal had relied on several constants: the predictability of human behavior, the assumptions of the authorities, and the subtle oversight of those focused on the immediate physical evidence. By controlling perception through objects, gestures, and minor manipulations, they had created a narrative that appeared solvable, simple, and linear. Yet the true pattern was far more intricate, spanning generations, exploiting loyalties, and leveraging historical grievances. He turned to Clara, who had been observing quietly. "Do you remember when you mentioned the papers being askew, Miss Faraday?" Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, I thought it was just carelessness. My aunt was meticulous, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Those slight irregularities," Ashcroft said, "are exactly what led us here. They were intended to be overlooked, yet they form part of the pattern connecting the past to the present. The criminal's strategy was to manipulate attention, ensuring that every apparent clue would lead investigators in the wrong direction, while the true orchestrator remained concealed." He examined Green again, noting the subtle tension in the butler's shoulders, the micro-expressions he had catalogued over several days. "Mr. Green," Ashcroft said quietly, The actions of the past and present intertwine in a design meant to mislead, but even the most careful manipulation leaves traces. Small, seemingly insignificant details, gestures, misplaced objects, minor comments, reveal the architecture of intent. The pattern is clear. The orchestration is deliberate, and now, with this note, the connection is visible. Green's eyes flicked toward the fireplace, then back to Ashcroft. He said nothing, but the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his awareness. The detective had uncovered the logic of the manipulations, the predictable sequence, the choreography, the subtle signs intended to control perception. The criminal's pattern, once invisible, was now illuminated, and with it, the path toward uncovering the mastermind had become apparent. Ashcroft moved carefully through the study, examining every object again, every paper, every trace of dust or movement. The pattern emerged not just from physical evidence, but from the interplay of human behavior and historical context. Each micro-expression, each hesitation, each gesture, when observed cumulatively, formed a signature of intent, a method by which the criminal guided the investigation without revealing themselves. He returned the note to its hidden position behind the books, ensuring no one would stumble upon it accidentally. The pattern it revealed, however, was now firmly in his mind. The locket, the altered will, the ledger, the notebook, the attack on the maid, all were orchestrated steps in a sequence designed to mislead, control, and conceal. The criminal had calculated every reaction, predicted every assumption, and now, with the pattern emerging, Ashcroft could anticipate the next move. The detective sat for a long moment in the quiet study, letting the realization settle. The chaos of the past days, the theft of the notebook, the psychological tests, the second incident, was not random but a meticulously executed series of events. The orchestration was deliberate, the manipulations precise, and the criminal's understanding of human nature profound. Ashcroft rose, his mind focused and resolute. The pattern was no longer hidden. The pieces of the puzzle, once isolated and meaningless, had coalesced into a coherent design. The criminal had relied on subtlety, misdirection, and human predictability, but even the most careful orchestration left cracks, small, observable, and now intelligible. The path to resolution was clear, and every subtle clue now contributed to the final revelation. Outside, the moonlight gleamed across the estate, casting long shadows that mirrored the intricate pattern Ashcroft had discerned. The detective understood that the next steps would require patience, precision, and an unyielding eye for detail. The criminal had relied on history, manipulation, and perception, but the emergence of the pattern had shifted the advantage. The stage was set, the pieces aligned, and Ashcroft, guided by observation, insight, and the faintest clues, was now poised to confront the orchestrator lurking behind the shadows of the past. Ashcroft spent the following morning immersed in meticulous review. The note, the ledger, and the subtle irregularities across the house now formed a coherent sequence, each detail reflecting a deliberate orchestration. Yet, even as the pattern became visible, he understood that the motive, what had driven the criminal to manipulate history, attack the innocent, and vanish evidence, remained hidden beneath layers of calculation. It was time to confront not just the acts, but the psychology behind them. He called Clara to the study, asking her to join him in reconstructing the sequence of events leading up to the discovery of the body. As she spoke, recounting what she remembered, Ashcroft's mind worked in parallel, tracing the connections between objects, behaviors, and historical grievances. Each comment she made about seemingly minor details, the position of a chair, the subtle smudge on a book spine, the slight misalignment of the desk papers, was cross-referenced against the ledger entries, the locket, and the note behind the books. It was a small observation that cracked the case open. Clara mentioned that the letter she had found in her aunt's writing desk, the one that appeared innocuous, had a peculiar phrasing, a repeated emphasis on loyalty, on obedience, and on the importance of rectifying old wrongs. Ashcroft paused, letting the words sink in. Rectifying old wrongs, he murmured. It's not about wealth, not about inheritance, it's about justice as they see it. His thoughts returned to Green. The butler had been careful, precise, and outwardly loyal, yet his micro-expressions, his reactions to the psychological questioning, and his subtle involvement with objects in the study indicated someone intimately invested in the outcomes. Ashcroft realized that Green's actions were not motivated by greed, but by a deeply rooted compulsion, the need to correct perceived historical injustices. The disappearance of Edward Morrow, the debts, the family disputes, Green had internalized them not as distant occurrences, but as unresolved obligations demanding action. He turned his attention to the locket again. I never forgot. It was no ordinary token of memory. It was a psychological anchor, a symbol of obsession. Green, or whoever was manipulating events through Green's presence, had allowed the past to dictate present action, forcing a cycle of vengeance and control. The broken locket, the manipulated documents, and the carefully staged disturbances were all expressions of this underlying motive. Clara noticed the intensity in Ashcroft's gaze and asked, "So it wasn't money, not really?" "Money was a tool, not the goal," Ashcroft said, pacing slowly. "Inheritance, debts, objects, they were instruments of influence used to manipulate perception. The real motive is psychological, the need to assert control over historical wrongs, to impose order where the individual feels there was chaos, and to enforce their version of justice, regardless of the human cost." He turned back to Green, who had been observing quietly, his composure strained. "The person responsible," Ashcroft said deliberately, "operated not for immediate gain, but for the satisfaction of orchestrating events according to their perception of right and wrong. They relied on subtle manipulation, psychological pressure, and historical knowledge to control everyone's understanding, ensuring that only they could navigate the sequence correctly. Their crimes were carefully calibrated, designed to be observed but misunderstood, to appear solvable yet remain shrouded in misdirection." Green's eyes flickered with a tension that betrayed more than mere concern. He shifted slightly, hands tightening at his sides. Ashcroft noted the subtle cues, a shoulder tensing, a fleeting glance toward the locket, the micro-expression of recognition when the psychological motives were articulated. He had suspected Green's involvement before, but now the underlying reason, the obsessive need to correct perceived historical wrongs, made the actions comprehensible in a way nothing else could. Ashcroft continued, linking the physical and psychological evidence. The notebook's removal, the attack on the maid, the placement of objects, the altered will, all these were orchestrated to maintain control of the narrative, to prevent interference, to manipulate perception, and to satisfy the criminal's compulsion to assert control over unresolved histories. It was never about greed alone. It was about imposing order upon chaos, shaping reality to conform to an internal sense of justice, and punishing those deemed responsible for perceived failures or transgressions of the past. Clara's eyes widened in realization. So, the estate, the debts, the old family disputes, they weren't incidental. They were tools, symbols, part of the reasoning behind all of this. "Yes," Ashcroft replied, calm but intense. "The entire house, the objects, the historical records, and even the people within it were elements in a carefully designed framework. The orchestrator was patient, methodical, and psychologically invested. The criminal's motive is revealed not in the obvious targets or immediate gains, but in the deeper need to rewrite history in a form that satisfies their obsessive sense of justice." He turned fully to Green, his expression sharp and unwavering. "Your loyalty, Mr. Green, has been admirable, but it has also made you an instrument of this compulsion. Every micro-expression, every hesitation, every controlled gesture you have exhibited was part of a careful dance, guided by fear, obligation, and a deep-seated belief that the past must be corrected." Green's face paled slightly, his composure wavering. For the first time, the butler's calm mask fractured enough to reveal a trace of genuine emotion, guilt, pride, and fear intertwined. I only wanted to see justice done," he said, voice low, almost a whisper. "The family, the debts, the wrongs, Someone had to restore balance. I didn't mean for anyone to be hurt. I only... Ashcroft nodded slowly, allowing Green to continue without interruption. The confession was not yet a complete admission of actions, but the psychology, the driving force, was now laid bare. The criminal had acted not from simple desire for wealth or revenge, but from a compulsion rooted in historical consciousness and obsessive moral rectitude. Every manipulation, every attack, every carefully placed object was an attempt to impose a version of order upon the chaotic legacy of the past. Clara shivered, realization dawning. So that's why everything seemed so deliberate. It wasn't just to mislead us, it was to satisfy something inside him. A need to fix what he thought was broken, Ashcroft agreed. Exactly. An understanding that motive is essential, because it explains not just the crimes but the methods, the subtleties, the psychological manipulations. The criminal isn't reckless. They are compulsive, precise, and guided by an internal logic that makes them all the more dangerous. They act to control the narrative, to anticipate reactions, and to protect their version of justice above all else. He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle. The hidden motive, the true psychological driver of the crimes, had finally emerged from the shadows. The criminal's reasoning, obsession with correcting historical wrongs, the compulsive need to orchestrate events, and the manipulation of perception was far more shocking than mere greed or revenge. It was a profound, dangerous conviction, capable of guiding actions that disregarded life and legality alike. Ashcroft leaned back, his eyes scanning the study, the objects, the ledger, the locket. The estate, the family history, and the seemingly innocuous details all became part of a comprehensible whole. The crime had never been straightforward. It had always been an expression of a mind driven by psychological compulsions and a distorted sense of moral duty. Understanding that hidden motive allowed the detective to anticipate the next steps, to identify vulnerabilities, and to approach the final confrontation with clarity. Outside, the estate basked in the muted light of early morning, serene yet deceptive. Inside, the revelations had shifted the balance. The orchestrator's psychology, laid bare, provided insight into actions past and likely behaviors future. Ashcroft knew the remaining challenge: to translate understanding of motive into practical strategy, to unravel the manipulations without allowing the compulsive mind behind them to strike again, and to bring closure to a sequence of crimes long shaped by history, obsession, and the relentless pursuit of self-fashioned justice. Ashcroft spent the morning in quiet preparation, reviewing every nuance of the evidence, every micro-expression, and every subtle irregularity he had observed over the past days. The pattern had emerged, the hidden motive revealed, and the psychological framework of the orchestrator mapped in his mind. What remained was action, a carefully designed confrontation that would force the villain to reveal themselves either through confession, flight, or an act of desperation. He called Clara to the study. "Miss Faraday, I need your cooperation," he said calmly. "Stay close, observe, but do not speak unless I instruct. The resolution depends on subtlety, patience, and precise timing. This is not merely about uncovering facts. It is about observing the reactions that confirm them." Clara nodded, apprehension visible in her eyes, yet a quiet determination underlying it. Ashcroft gave her a reassuring glance, then returned his attention to Green, who remained in the study, outwardly composed yet with a tension that Ashcroft could see in the slight stiffness of his posture. "Mr. Green," Ashcroft began, voice steady, "we now understand the true nature of the events that have transpired. Your actions, guided by the desire to correct perceived historical wrongs, have had consequences beyond your intention. Yet the framework of your manipulations leaves certain traces, small, consistent, and impossible to fully erase." Green's jaw tightened slightly, his hands flexing at his sides. "Inspector, I have done what I thought necessary. I never intended—" Ashcroft held up a hand, cutting him off. "Intent is not the question, method is, and method leaves evidence, even when concealed beneath layers of calculation. Your removal of the notebook, the placement of the locket, the disturbances in the study, all designed to control perception, are now understood. You have relied on subtlety, but subtlety cannot escape observation. Green's composure flickered for a moment, a micro-expression of fear and frustration passing across his features. Ashcroft noted it carefully. We will now conduct a final review of the house, room by room. You will accompany us. Any further attempts to manipulate the environment or mislead observations will be noted and addressed. The time for deception is over. Ashcroft led the way, Clara close behind, Green following, silent but visibly tense. The detective moved with measured pace, examining each room with meticulous attention, noting every displaced object, every slight smudge or scuff mark, every detail that might reveal action taken in secrecy. His mind worked constantly, connecting gestures, objects, and historical references into a coherent narrative that could now be directly confronted. As they reached the library, Ashcroft's eyes fell on the fireplace mantel, where the smudge of dust he had noted days before now seemed significant in the context of Green's movements. He stepped closer, pointing subtly at the streak. The smudge along the mantel. It was made deliberately, but carelessly. The pattern of handling matches movements associated with the locket, and aligns with entries in the ledger concerning Edward Morrow's disappearance. Small, deliberate movements, designed to mislead observers, yet they leave a record nonetheless. Green's fingers flexed involuntarily. He shifted slightly, and Ashcroft, patient and observant, recognized the final crack in his composure. "Do you understand now, Mr. Green?" Ashcroft asked, voice calm but unyielding. "The evidence, the objects, the behavior, they all form a pattern you relied upon to mislead, yet a pattern that cannot be hidden from careful observation. Your motive, your methods, and your manipulations are now fully exposed. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?" The butler's face tightened. A long silence followed, charged with tension. Then Green spoke, voice low and edged with desperation. I only sought to balance what was unbalanced. I didn't mean for it to go so far. I thought if I controlled the narrative, kept the household in line, nothing would go wrong. But I see now. I misjudged everything." Ashcroft's gaze never wavered. And yet, the actions were taken. The locket broken, the notebook removed, the maid attacked. You acted, and now you must accept the consequences. The deception, the manipulation, and the orchestration, all are understood. Do you confess willingly, or will I compel the truth through continued observation and cross-examination? Green's hands trembled subtly. His composure, once carefully constructed, now faltered under the pressure of Ashcroft's patient and precise scrutiny. I confess," he said finally, voice trembling. "I orchestrated the events, controlled the placement of objects, removed the notebook. I thought I could manage everything, maintain the balance, restore what was lost, but I lost control." Ashcroft noted every detail, the confession, the micro-expressions of guilt and anxiety, the subtle gestures of a man unaccustomed to being fully observed under pressure. Every movement validated the pattern he had reconstructed. The orchestration, the compulsive control, the manipulation of perception. The criminal had acted according to psychological compulsion, and now the psychological truth had emerged fully, exposing not just actions but motivations. "Very well, Mr. Green," Ashcroft said quietly, yet firmly. "Your understanding of history and your meticulous manipulation of the household are now recorded and will be addressed accordingly. The truth has been revealed, and your actions can no longer hide behind subtlety or loyalty." Green's head bowed slightly, his body rigid but defeated. The tension in the room eased slightly, though the weight of the crimes lingered palpably. Clara exhaled softly, relief evident. Yet Ashcroft knew the resolution required more than acknowledgement. It required careful documentation, securing of evidence, and verification of every manipulated detail. He walked the house one final time, confirming the placement of objects, the patterns of movement, and the corroboration of every reaction he had observed. Each room told the story of the orchestration, the subtle manipulations, and the compulsive drive behind Green's actions. The locket, the ledger, the notebook, the smudges, all were now accounted for. Each connected logically to the psychological motive he had reconstructed. Finally, Ashcroft returned to the study. standing between Clara and Green. "The case is concluded," he said, voice steady. "The orchestration, the manipulations, and the hidden motives have been exposed. The pattern, once invisible, is now clear. Your actions, Mr. Green, cannot alter the truth, and the resolution depends on acknowledging both the history you sought to control and the consequences of your interventions." Green's shoulders slumped, the final resistance in his expression vanishing. Clara's eyes met Ashcroft's, gratitude and relief mingling with lingering tension. The house, quiet and still once more, seemed to breathe with the resolution of long-concealed truths. The criminal's careful orchestration, the subtle psychological manipulations, and the intricate pattern that had guided every action were now fully exposed, leaving only the final work of documentation, accountability, and reflection. Ashcroft allowed himself a brief pause, sensing the completion of a complex intellectual and psychological puzzle. The trap had worked, the confrontation had succeeded, and the orchestrator's compulsive drive had been confronted with unyielding observation. The pieces, once scattered across time, space, and behavior, had been aligned, and the case, woven through history, obsession, and meticulous design, was finally resolved. Ashcroft had begun the process of organizing the evidence, carefully cataloguing Green's confession, the sequence of events, and the psychological profile that had driven the crimes. The house had settled into a quiet stillness, the tension easing as if the estate itself acknowledged the resolution. Clara moved quietly through the rooms, restoring displaced objects and straightening papers, while Green remained in the study, subdued, his gaze fixed on the floor. Ashcroft allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, reflecting on the precision with which the case had unfolded. The pattern had emerged, the motive revealed, and the final confrontation had secured the confession that confirmed both method and intent. Yet even as he prepared to complete his notes, a lingering unease tugged at him, the sense that some subtle variable had escaped full observation, some detail overlooked in the intricate web of manipulation. He returned to the library to double-check the ledger and the placement of the objects as he had done countless times over the past days. That's when he noticed it, a small envelope, neatly tucked between the pages of a ledger entry from decades earlier, one he had already examined multiple times. Its presence should have been meaningless. He had seen it before, dismissed it as a minor record. But now, in the context of Green's confession and the orchestrated events, it seemed too deliberate to ignore. Ashcroft carefully extracted the envelope, noting the faintly faded handwriting that did not match any of the familiar hands in the household. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The words were brief, almost cryptic. "The locket is only the beginning, the pattern is controlled, but the final thread is mine." Ashcroft's pulse quickened, the phrasing, the handwriting, the implication. Someone else had orchestrated a layer beneath Green's actions, someone who had manipulated events from the shadows, guiding Green without his full awareness. Green had been a pawn, a compulsive player driven by historical grievances, but the true mastermind remained unknown, operating in deliberate obscurity. He looked across the room at Green, whose shoulders stiffened, the faintest flicker of fear passing across his features. "I don't know anything about that," Green said, voice tight, but Ashcroft observed the hesitation, the micro-expression, and the subtle avoidance of eye contact. A master manipulator could exploit those gaps, and Green, despite his confession, might have been following instructions from someone he trusted, or feared, without recognizing the larger design. Ashcroft refocused on the note. The words, "the final thread is mine," implied intent, planning, and oversight beyond Green's capacity. Someone had anticipated every step, the notebook, the locket, the disturbances, even the behavioral observations Ashcroft had made. The second crime, the theft, the attack, they all aligned with a broader strategy, orchestrated by a mind several steps ahead. Green had been executing moves within this framework, believing himself in control, when in truth, he was part of a larger scheme. He paced the study, reviewing the events in sequence, the initial crime, the missing notebook, the subtle clues, the psychological manipulations, the attack on the maid, Green's confession. Each act had seemed final, self-contained, Yet now it was clear that the threads converged on a hidden hand, a strategist who had been shaping events from the shadows. Ashcroft realized that the mastermind must have intimate knowledge of the household, access to its records, and the ability to observe Green without revealing themselves. Someone with authority, trust, and foresight, capable of directing compulsive behavior and influencing decisions subtly over time. It was no longer just a matter of reconstructing Green's motives or the sequence of events. Ashcroft now had to identify the hidden puppeteer before any further manipulation could occur. He summoned Clara. "Miss Faraday, stay close and observe carefully. We may have overlooked a key player, someone who has remained invisible until now. Watch for subtle cues, deviations in behavior, anything that seems out of place." Together, they retraced Green's movements over the past days, noting every visitor, every conversation, every interaction he had with others. Ashcroft focused on recurring patterns, cross-referencing them with the historical documents, ledger entries, and the note from the envelope. One observation struck him as odd. Green's interactions with Mrs. Faraday's solicitor had been unusually frequent, and at times coded in mannerisms, gestures, and phrasing that Green himself may not have consciously recognized as following instruction. Ashcroft's mind raced. The solicitor had unrestricted access to the estate, intimate knowledge of the will, and the ability to observe Green and others discreetly. The more he examined, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Green's compulsive orchestration, guided by historical grievance, was being subtly manipulated by someone else with a deeper, more controlling purpose. He confronted Green once more, calmly but firmly. "Mr. Green, did anyone advise you, guide you, or suggest actions while claiming to be acting in your interest? Was there someone whose counsel you followed without fully recognizing their influence?" Green's eyes darted, the hesitation obvious. His voice trembled slightly. There was advice from Mr. Langley, the solicitor. He spoke of righting wrongs, of protecting the family legacy, of ensuring balance. I thought it was guidance. I didn't realize it could be part of a larger scheme." Ashcroft's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Langley," he murmured, recalling the solicitor's presence throughout the investigation. Always cooperative, calm, and seemingly neutral. The pattern now becomes clearer. Green was a channel, a compulsive executor, and you, sir, were the unseen hand. Minutes later, Ashcroft arranged a discreet confrontation. Langley arrived at the estate, oblivious to the depth of the detective's insight. Ashcroft observed every subtle reaction, the handshake that lingered too long, the slight narrowing of eyes at questions, the almost imperceptible shift in weight. Then Ashcroft spoke, measured and unyielding. "Mr. Langley, the sequence of events, the placement of objects, the manipulations of perception, they were never random. You guided Green, knowingly exploiting his compulsions, orchestrating events across the estate. Every micro-expression, every minor disturbance, every stolen notebook, they were designed to mislead while furthering your aims." Langley's composure wavered for the first time. I was only trying to protect the family name," he said, voice tight. I didn't foresee the consequences." Ashcroft's eyes remained steady. Protecting a name is one thing. Orchestrating deception, manipulating another human being's compulsions, and endangering lives is another. The crimes, though appearing to end with Green's confession, were only steps in your plan. You are the final architect of this scheme, the hidden hand behind every subtle manipulation. Langley's face paled, the calm authority replaced by tension and fear. Every carefully maintained veneer cracked under the weight of the detective's insight. The final twist had emerged. The orchestrator had been invisible, guiding the events from behind the scenes, testing both Green's compulsions and Ashcroft's deductive prowess. Ashcroft allowed a brief pause, observing the subtle micro-expressions, the involuntary gestures, the tension in Langley's hands. The genius of the detective lay in recognizing that the orchestration extended beyond the immediate actors, that the compulsive butler had been a pawn in a far more complex game. And now, with the final revelation exposed, The invisible mastermind was at last revealed, confronting the full weight of both observation and justice. The estate, quiet once more, seemed to hold its breath. The intricate web of crimes, manipulations, and compulsions had finally been traced to its source. Green, once the apparent architect, was revealed to be an instrument. Langley, the trusted solicitor, was the true hand guiding the sequence, his motives rooted in control, preservation, and manipulation. The case, which had seemed resolved, had delivered one final twist, a testament to the depth of human cunning, the subtlety of psychological orchestration, and the relentless clarity of observation. Ashcroft stood in the center of the study, the final revelation illuminating the entire investigation. The pattern, the motive, and the orchestrations, all now clear, yet it had required not just patience and observation, but an understanding of human psychology, historical continuity, and the careful unmasking of subtle manipulation. The final twist had tested his genius, and he had met it, ready to bring the hidden architect into the light. The air in the estate was thick with tension as Ashcroft stepped back, observing Langley's reaction to the revelation. The solicitor's face, once the mask of calm authority, now bore the strain of recognition, the awareness that his orchestration, subtle and layered, had been unmasked. Green, subdued and defeated, remained at the side, a pawn fully exposed to the consequences of his compulsions, while Clara clutched her hands, apprehensive yet trusting in Ashcroft's judgment. Ashcroft's mind raced as he pieced together the final sequence of events. Langley's manipulation had been masterful. He had exploited Green's obsessive tendencies, nudging the butler to act in ways that served both to obscure his own involvement and to control the household. The locket, the notebook, the slight disturbances across rooms, even the attack on the maid, each was a calculated move in a psychological chess game designed to appear as independent incidents while advancing Langley's hidden agenda. "Mr. Langley," Ashcroft said, voice firm but calm, "the evidence, the behaviors, the placement of objects, all of it aligns to a pattern you created. Green acted with compulsion, driven by perceived historical grievances, but you guided him. Every hesitation he displayed, every micro-expression was exploited, directing the investigation without revealing your presence." Langley's gaze wavered, his confidence eroded. I only sought to protect the estate, to preserve the legacy. I never intended harm." Ashcroft shook his head slowly. "Intent does not absolve responsibility. You manipulated both the environment and human behavior, and your orchestration resulted in injury, deception, and the death of Edward Morrow. The subtlety of your methods does not shield you from accountability. Every overlooked gesture, every misplaced object, every coincidental observation you thought clever has been reconstructed." He gestured toward the mantle, the ledgers, and the locket. "Observe these details. The smudge on the mantle, faint but deliberate, the folded note in the ledger, placed decades ago to guide a chain of actions, the positioning of the locket and papers, all signals you intended to obscure your presence. Yet they contain a logic, a sequence, a rhythm that any careful observer could detect. Green acted as an executor. You were the architect, and every move, every subtle cue, has led us here." Langley swallowed hard, his composure failing completely. I didn't expect anyone to see it so clearly. I thought my guidance would be invisible." Ashcroft's lips curved slightly, a mixture of pity and resolution. "Invisibility is an illusion. You underestimated observation, deduction, and the value of subtlety when applied to human behavior. You relied on assumptions, that no one would notice the repeated emphasis on loyalty, the orchestrated misplacement of objects, the patterns in gestures and speech. But all of these were observable, reconstructible, and ultimately revealing. The genius of detection lies not just in noticing the obvious, but in discerning the invisible threads woven through human behavior and environment. And that is why this investigation has succeeded." Clara exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing, but Ashcroft noted her eyes lingering on Langley, uncertain whether justice would truly be delivered. The solicitor's expression was now one of defeat. but the calculating mind that had orchestrated the events still flickered behind his eyes. A spark of intent, the possibility of further manipulation, perhaps an escape yet unattempted. Ashcroft walked slowly around the room, summarizing the final analysis for both Clara and Green. The clues that were overlooked by others are precisely what revealed the truth. The micro-expressions, the hesitations, the unusual positioning of objects, the cryptic note hidden within the ledger, and the subtle psychological influence exercised over Green. Each was a breadcrumb, designed to mislead if interpreted superficially, but together they form a coherent pattern, exposing both method and motive. He paused, letting the weight of the explanation settle. Green was driven by compulsive historical loyalty, but his actions were manipulated by Langley, who remained invisible until this final confrontation. The pattern, once obscured by the apparent simplicity of the crime and the assumed independence of actions, is now fully understood. This is why observation, insight, and an understanding of human behavior are indispensable in solving such intricate crimes. Langley's hands trembled slightly as the implications sank in. He had been fully unmasked, his manipulations exposed, yet in the next moment, Ashcroft's eyes narrowed. Something about the solicitor's composure, the subtle lift of his chin, suggested calculation beyond mere resignation. Langley's escape seemed possible if only he could exploit a single lapse in vigilance. Before Ashcroft could act further, a sudden noise echoed from the upper floor, a creak of a floorboard, deliberate and careful. Langley's gaze flicked upward, and in that instant, Ashcroft recognized the truth. The mastermind had prepared contingencies, a last-minute maneuver to vanish should the confrontation fail. Green's confession and the exposure of Langley's manipulations had cornered him, yet he had anticipated this, leaving a path for potential flight. Ashcroft moved swiftly, but the moment passed. Langley remained seated, restrained only by his awareness that escape now would draw attention from both the authorities outside and the observant detective before him. The possibility of evasion lingered like a shadow, unresolved yet real, a final testament to the mind that had orchestrated the events. "Justice may be served formally," Ashcroft said aloud, voice measured, "but the mind capable of such orchestration does not always vanish entirely. We can account for actions, motives, and manipulations, yet the intellectual force behind them may endure beyond immediate accountability. Awareness of subtle influence is the final safeguard against unseen designs." Clara looked at Ashcroft, uncertainty in her eyes. "So, is it over? Has he truly been caught?" Ashcroft regarded the solicitor, whose outward defeat was now tempered by a calculating restraint. "For the present, yes. The crimes have been exposed, the patterns revealed, and the manipulations documented. Green has confessed Langley's orchestration is unmasked, and the sequence is fully understood. But we must recognize the unsettling reality. The intellect capable of such precise orchestration may yet survive beyond the immediate resolution. Justice has been delivered, but vigilance remains necessary. Some threads, though cut, can be woven again if left unchecked." Green remained silent, a mixture of relief and regret on his face. Langley, finally subdued, did not respond, his expression carefully controlled, as though already plotting contingencies beyond immediate observation. Ashcroft, aware of the lingering tension, allowed the stillness of the house to settle around him, knowing that the resolution of actions did not necessarily eliminate the echoes of design and manipulation left in their wake. The detective's final review of the estate confirmed the meticulous attention to detail, the subtle patterns of influence, and the overlooked psychological cues. Every object, every gesture, every comment now had context, and every manipulation had been accounted for. Yet the knowledge of human cunning and the capacity for deliberate orchestration left a quiet, unsettling sense of unfinished business, a reminder that even when justice appears complete, the intellect capable of subversion may linger, poised beyond immediate reach. Ashcroft stepped out into the early evening, the air crisp and clear, allowing a moment of reflection. The estate behind him bore the evidence of resolution, yet the shadows of human calculation remained, a final acknowledgement that true understanding observation, and vigilance are eternal companions in the pursuit of justice. The case was formally closed, the pattern unveiled, and the manipulations exposed, but the last-minute twist, the possibility of an unseen contingency, left a subtle reminder that human ingenuity, even when confronted, cannot be entirely restrained. Ashcroft walked slowly down the gravel drive, the sun dipping toward the horizon and casting long shadows across the estate. The air carried a crisp chill, and the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke seemed almost to echo the tension that had filled the house just hours earlier. Green had been taken into custody, Langley formally restrained under close observation, and Clara had returned to the house to begin the delicate task of restoring order and documentation. Yet even as the detective placed one hand on the gate's wrought iron frame and turned to leave, a persistent sense of incompletion tugged at him, a subtle disturbance that refused to dissipate. He reviewed the events in his mind: the initial murder, the missing notebook, the locket, the psychological manipulations, Green's compulsions, Langley's orchestration, and the final exposure of the hidden patterns. On the surface, the case was closed, the threads neatly untangled, the criminal minds accounted for. But Ashcroft knew the truth of investigations like these. Human cunning rarely revealed itself fully in the first pass, and a single overlooked clue could ripple outward in unexpected ways. He recalled the envelope hidden in the ledger, the cryptic line: "The locket is only the beginning. The pattern is controlled, but the final thread is mine." Green had confessed, Langley had been exposed, yet Ashcroft's instincts whispered that the note had not fully disclosed the intended scope of the manipulations. It had been subtle, perhaps deliberately incomplete, a breadcrumb for the observant or a warning of contingency plans yet unexecuted. As he walked along the perimeter of the estate, Ashcroft's eyes fell upon the library windows. He paused, noting a faint streak across the glass he had not recorded before, smudged, deliberate, yet too precise to be random. He crouched, inspecting the area. The streak traced a subtle diagonal across the pane, almost imperceptible, and yet, when examined under the angle of the setting sun, it revealed the faint impression of a hand gripping the frame from inside, a detail unnoticed in the flurry of the final confrontation. A chill ran down his spine. The implication was unmistakable. Someone had been inside the library recently, after the confrontations, or had left an additional marker meant to be discovered later. It could be a warning, a taunt, or an overlooked player entirely, a participant whose motives and manipulations had remained outside the observable pattern. Even Langley, defeated and exposed, might not have acted alone. Someone else, patient and careful, might have orchestrated contingencies beyond immediate detection. Ashcroft rose, brushing dust from his coat, and continued along the path, his gaze shifting to the edge of the estate, where the woods crept close to the manicured grounds. He noted the faint footprints of a single individual, partially obscured by fallen leaves and soft mud, moving toward the perimeter fence. The impressions were subtle, almost hesitant, suggesting careful navigation rather than panicked flight. Someone had lingered, observed, and left traces only now becoming apparent. A silent observer, perhaps allied with the manipulations already revealed, or entirely independent, using the chaos as cover for a personal agenda. The detective's mind catalogued the possibilities: a second accomplice, a hidden rival within the household staff, or a distant figure aware of the estate's history and poised to act should the initial orchestration fail. The cryptic message in the ledger, the unnoticed smudge, and the discreet footprints all pointed toward the unsettling truth. The mystery might be concluded for now, yet the potential for continuation remained. He paused at the gate, watching the fading light bleed across the horizon. Clara's voice floated softly from the windows as she spoke to Green in the distance, offering what comfort she could to a man ensnared in compulsive guilt. Langley remained in the house, outwardly subdued, yet Ashcroft could sense the quiet, calculating energy of a mind still scheming, even within constraints. The balance of control, once assumed resolved, was now more fragile than ever. Ashcroft's gaze drifted to the hedgerows lining the drive. Between the shadows and the evening light, he noticed a small metallic glint partially hidden in the undergrowth. He crouched to examine it, a thin pin, engraved with an intricate pattern he did not immediately recognize, yet deliberately placed. It was a calling card, perhaps, or a clue planted to be found only by the observant, a subtle signal that someone else was still at work, monitoring, guiding, or waiting. The detective rose slowly, his mind alive with possibilities. The estate, for all its apparent order, was layered with secrets, each revelation opening the door to deeper enigmas. Patterns were discernible, motives understood, and culpabilities assigned, but the faint smudges, cryptic messages, and careful traces told him that the story was not entirely finished. Human behavior, when driven by obsession, fear, or ambition, often extended beyond the immediate frame of observation, and Ashcroft had learned long ago that the most dangerous manipulations were those that remained unseen until it was too late. He walked toward his carriage, the gravel crunching underfoot, yet his mind traced invisible paths through the estate, Green's compulsions, Langley's orchestration, the hidden observer, and the subtle markers left for discovery. Every detail, however minor, could signal continuation, a new layer of influence, or a forthcoming challenge. The resolution of one thread did not erase the network of possibilities, nor the knowledge that someone else, patient, calculating, and unseen, might still shape events from the shadows. As the carriage wheels began to turn, Ashcroft leaned slightly out of the window, glancing back at the estate one last time. The sun had fully set, leaving the grounds cloaked in twilight. The mansion, serene and deceptively silent, held the weight of secrets that had yet to fully surface. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, recognizing that the resolution had been significant, yet the lingering traces of subtle design and cryptic signaling left a lingering question, a whisper of unfinished business that refused to be ignored. The detective's hand rested on the window frame as the carriage moved down the lane. Behind him, the estate receded into shadow, but his mind remained sharp, cataloging the subtle cues and hidden messages still unaccounted for. Somewhere, a mind capable of manipulation and long-term planning lingered, and Ashcroft knew the game was not yet over. The final twist, the unseen contingency, and the cryptic signals promised that another mystery awaited, one that would demand the same careful observation, patient deduction, and understanding of human psychology that had carried him through this intricate web. As the carriage carried him into the encroaching night, Ashcroft allowed a faint smile to form. The case was closed, yet the horizon held a subtle, tantalizing uncertainty. The threads of human cunning, obsession, and subtle orchestration had not vanished. They were merely awaiting the next opportunity to manifest. The detective's work, as ever, would continue, not in reaction alone, but in anticipation, guided by observation, insight, and the knowledge that even resolved mysteries may conceal new layers for those perceptive enough to discern them. The estate disappeared behind the trees, but the echo of unanswered questions, faint traces, and cryptic signals lingered in the cool night air. Ashcroft's mind was already at work, poised for the next revelation, the next twist, and the next challenge, knowing that in the world of human ambition and hidden motives, a mystery never truly ends.